Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Redlines. This week, the defense industry and government-funded Hudson Institute hosted a special conversation between senior fellow Heather Nauert and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Kelly Craft. You might remember Nauert from her days as a Fox News host turned Trump administration State Department spokeswoman, while Ambassador Craft has established her reputation in the diplomatic community by serving as the wife of a major coal magnate and Republican megadonor who essentially bought her position within the current administration with a cool $2 million donation to the Trump campaign. Focused on maintaining U.S. leadership amid shifting geopolitics, their discussion ranged from the supposed evils of the World Health Organization and United Nations to Syria, where Craft recently paid a trip to the border of Turkey and al-Qaeda-controlled Idlib, to Venezuela. And while the interview has not received much attention in the media, I think it's important to highlight some of their comments, considering Ambassador Craft is currently one of the most powerful U.S. diplomats in the world, and that her often kooky commentary was extremely revealing of Washington's disturbing priorities. Consider, for example, the way in which these women twisted a conversation about the proliferation of chemical weapons in Syria, which, by the way, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons declared to have come to an end years ago, into fear-mongering about Iran's influence in Venezuela.
You know, there are some Americans who feel like Syria is so far away, that we've been able to contain Syria in a sense where it's not affecting us here. But there's a very real concern about proliferation of weapons. So could you just sort of address that proliferation of weapons, chemical weapons in the region, and how that could be distributed elsewhere? For example, we see Iran involved in places like Venezuela.
Well, you know, we have to just remember that Iran and Hezbollah are deeply involved in orchestrating and providing direct support for Assad's horrific, barbaric attacks against the Syrian people. And you know, if the chemical weapons are if we do not shine a light on them in Syria, then they will be everywhere. You know Iran's behavior in Venezuela. I mean, they're bad actors. They're bad actors all over the globe. And we have a situation, as you well know, with Maduro, with Iran, with Cuba, China, Russia, everyone propping up the Maduro regime. It is something that's been really highlighted recently. And we have to continue to support Guaido in the National Assembly and stress to him the importance of promoting a free and fair and transparent election process within Venezuela. You know, I visited the border. I was in Colombia. I saw firsthand the plight of the Venezuelan people.
Right. So according to Ambassador Craft, the U.S. public should support continued war against Syria and Iran because if they don't, chemical weapons are somehow going to appear in Venezuela. This is textbook WMD fear-mongering. But notice at least that Ambassador Craft did not refer to Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela and merely associated him with the country's National Assembly. Sucks to suck. Now, moving on, Heather Nauert seems extremely concerned about waning U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. She laments the fact that rising powers such as Russia and China support Venezuela's elected government, or in her words, Maduro's goons, and asks Ambassador Craft how the U.S. can possibly beat them back.
Part of what makes the situation in Venezuela so difficult, as you mentioned, are all the outside actors, Russia, Iran, Cuba, protecting Maduro's goons who are protecting him. So what is it going to take, do you think, to get some of those other countries out of the sphere of influence of Venezuela?
You know, I think we just have to maintain applying our sanctions and a maximum pressure campaign on whether it is Iran or Russia, China, Cuba. I mean, we have to really constantly highlight the atrocities that the Maduro regime to their people. I mean, I think the people need to understand that we care, that Americans are there.
Where to begin with that one? How about with the fact the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations just vowed a maximum pressure campaign not only against Venezuela, but against its allies, from Beijing to Moscow. Craft is referring to so-called secondary sanctions, or unilateral coercive measures, which punish third parties for doing business with Venezuela. As the Associated Press reported in 2019, such measures would have a devastating impact on Venezuela's economy, as countries such as India and Malaysia, which now buy 46% of Venezuela's exports, could decide they're better off reducing trade out of fear of repercussions. But in reality, secondary sanctions are unnecessary because current U.S. unilateral coercive measures already have the effect of what's known as over-compliance. Reuters explains, quote, Washington's escalating series of sanctions have created unintended consequences by prompting banks and other institutions to halt activities that are not explicitly banned by the measures, known as over-compliance. In other words, corporations, financial institutions, and nations already avoid doing business with Venezuela because they believe Washington will reprimand them now or in the future. This is precisely why even U.S. allies in Europe reject the U.S.'s continued and increasing reliance on financial warfare, because it restricts even their ability to conduct free trade. Back over in country club quarantine, however,
I think it's always worth mentioning that sanctions don't cover, or rather medical equipment and medicine is exempt from sanctions. Sanctions, obviously a big hallmark of this administration's foreign policy, but I think that is worth mentioning.
Oh, Heather, they prepped you so well at the State Department. Just had to make sure you worked in that tired little lie that U.S. unilateral coercive measures don't target medical supplies, even though they absolutely do. Venezuela has documented numerous instances in which payments its government made for basic medicines were blocked due to the fact U.S. restrictions prevented financial institutions from transferring Venezuelan funds. The very fact billions of dollars worth of Venezuelan wealth is stored in Europe and the United States and currently frozen due to U.S. unilateral coercive measures means that money cannot be used to purchase anything. For example, in 2006, Venezuela's government negotiated an agreement with Italy so that children in need of bone marrow transplants could travel to Europe and receive life-saving treatment. But the program has been on hold since 2018, when U.S. financial restrictions blocked a Portuguese bank, Novo Banco, from transferring Venezuela's payment for the program. As a result, at least 4 children died waiting for treatment in just the span of a few weeks last year alone. The truth is, U.S. dominance over the global financial system allows Washington to implement financial sanctions illegally and unilaterally. That's what makes these measures different from actual sanctions. The term sanctions implies punishment for an actual crime, and historically have been applied through international institutions such as the United Nations, which actually enjoy legal jurisdiction over its member states. Over recent years, however, Washington has issued such financial restrictions unilaterally out of the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control or through executive order in the White House. The measures are not based in international law, but rather the U.S.'s belief that its own laws and policy apply to and govern the entire world. Nauert and Kraft clearly believe as much, even though neither of them are particularly qualified to hold high-level government positions. But there's a bright side to that fact, which is that they sometimes let information they probably should have kept secret slip out publicly.
I have been reaching out to most of the ambassadors at the United Nations and just checking on them. And I think that personal touch of calling and saying, how are you? You know, how are your children? How's your family? Is there anything we can do as the host country? And, you know, you better believe they have questions. And, you know, and they have questions about whether it's school, you know, for their children. And if I don't have the answer, then I have an incredible team at the USUN, our host country experts, or we will reach out to the governor's team in the state of New York.
Whoops! Nothing like using U.S. government connections to bribe foreign diplomats into supporting Washington's hostile agenda. Play ball with Ambassador Kraft at the UN, and she just might place a call in order to ensure your kid can play lacrosse and do Jaeger bombs at your choice of elite East Coast educational institutions. How considerate. Any other closing thoughts, Ambassador?
There is no better administration that understands the importance of American tax-paying dollars in countries. And it's a really sense of pride when you travel to these countries and you see the dollars that we are all spending and the results. And it also makes you fight even harder for the people that we're helping and for the American taxpayers. So there's not a better administration, there's not a more caring administration to be able to represent than the Trump administration. And I know you know that firsthand. And it's one of the greatest pleasures of being able to work with you is that we do understand our obligation, and that is to protect our taxpayers, protect the American interests of peace and security. And then, as Americans do, we're always the first in to help the rest of the world and the last to leave.
First in and last to leave. Just ask the people of Korea, Japan, Germany, Vietnam, Iraq, Honduras, Afghanistan, Syria. The list goes on and on. Permanent U.S. military bases and occupation for all. Who wouldn't want that?